So, welcome back. And about a month ago, I came across something that caught my attention. It was a joint meeting between two of the main financial regulators in the United States, the SEC and the CFTC. And it's the kind of video that still surprises me that I sit down to watch, honestly. Two regulatory agencies discussing policy frameworks probably isn't most people's idea of entertainment. And it's slowly becoming my version of entertainment. But something about this meeting made me stop in my tracks. Because in that meeting, both agencies were talking about how they're replacing their tools and infrastructure for crypto legislation that may move through the Senate soon. And that immediately stood out to me because historically, these two agencies haven't exactly worked together when it comes to crypto or anything. For years, they've debated who should regulate this space, where one agency's authority ends and the other begins. But in this meeting, they weren't debating jurisdiction. They were actually talking about how to prepare together. If you're new here, this channel is where I use XRP as a lens to understand in real time how money, infrastructure, and global coordination are quietly changing the world that we see. And today, I want to explore something very interesting. Inside the crypto world, the conversation often sounds like America is falling behind on regulation. But if you step outside the world of crypto and look at the broader headlines right now, the focus is on something very different. Depending on where you look, the story is about war, or about how much money is being spent, or about whether actions that have been taken were authorized, or about who is winning this said war. But buried underneath all of that noise is something much quieter. And that's what actually caught my attention. Because the moment we're living in right now is complicated. The uncomfortable truth is that it feels like the world trusts each other less than it used to. World powers are being openly questioned for the choices that they make and who those choices actually benefit. Oil, one of the most important commodities in the global economy, is creating tensions globally. Sanctions that have been placed on Russia are being reconsidered. Arab alliances that once seemed stable are shifting. And even long standing allies are asking whether they can follow world leaders into war, which for me raises a question that feels louder every day. Who can we trust? And how do we protect our citizens or our interest? And maybe an even bigger question comes to mind. Are those two things actually the same? Interest and citizens. So, while all of that noise fills the headlines, something else is happening quietly in the background. And I think it matters more than most people realize. Because financial infrastructure, the plumbing that moves value across the world, is what makes geopolitical decisions possible in the first place. Sanctions only work if you control the rails. Alliances are partly economic. Trust between nations is partly about whose financial system the world agrees to operate inside. So, when two of the most important financial regulatory bodies in the United States start preparing for a new kind of asset together, quietly, ahead of any legislation, that's not just a small detail. That's part of the same story. To understand why this meeting was unusual, I think it helps to understand the history between these two agencies. The SEC traditionally oversees securities, things like stocks, investment contracts, and the markets where companies raise capital. The CFTC oversees commodities and derivatives, markets tied to things like oil, agriculture, and future contracts. And when digital assets appeared, they didn't fit neatly into either of those categories, which meant the question became simple, but incredibly important. Are these assets securities or are they commodities? Because depending on the answer, the regulator changes, the rules change, the future of the industry changes. For most of crypto's history, those two agencies weren't preparing together. They were actually competing over who should be in charge. The new CFTC chair referenced something in this meeting that I think deserves more attention. He mentioned the Shad-Johnson Accord. In the early 1980s, the SEC and the CFTC had a very similar fight, this time over single stock futures, contracts that let you bet on the future price of an individual company's stock. Both agencies wanted jurisdiction. Neither would back down. And the result was that single stock futures were effectively banned in the United States for nearly 2 decades. Not because the product was dangerous, not because the market didn't want them, but because two agencies could not agree on a shared rulebook. Meanwhile, those products flourished in other countries. American investors who wanted them had to go offshore. Congress eventually forced a resolution in 2000. But by then, 18 years had already passed. 18 years of a product category that existed everywhere except in the United States. That's the history that was sitting in the room during that meeting. And the new CFTC chair brought it up deliberately. He was saying, we've seen what happens when we don't figure this out. We're not doing that again, is what he said. Which brings me to something that I think is easy to miss in this meeting. The new CFTC chair, Brian Selig, didn't come up through the CFTC. He actually came up from the SEC. He built his regulatory thinking there. He worked directly alongside Hester Pierce, one of the SEC chairs, on the crypto task force during the early months of this administration. The SEC chair credits him with doing more to clarify crypto's regulatory status in a single year than the prior decade combined. And then he was nominated to run the CFTC. That's not a standard career move, in my opinion. You don't put a person from the SEC in charge of the CFTC by accident. You do it when you want both bodies operating with the same language. When you want the person setting the CFTC rules to already understand how the SEC thinks, and vice versa. This meeting wasn't two agencies simultaneously deciding to cooperate. It was the visible result of a deliberate personnel decision made well before anyone walked into that room. Paul Atkins had already been building on the SEC side for months. Sleg gets confirmed at the CFTC, and his first public act is to bring the CFTC into what Paul Atkins already has started. That's a sequence. And I believe sequences like this have intention behind them. And his first public remarks as CFTC chairman were delivered at the CFTC's own headquarters, standing next to the SEC chair. That staging alone tells you something. The initiative is called Project Crypto, and it's actually started months earlier, shortly after the election, as an SEC initiative launch by Chairman Atkins to modernize how the SEC approaches digital assets. What this meeting represented was something different. The CFTC formally joining it. For the first time ever, both agencies under the same roof building toward the same framework together. And what makes this interesting isn't the name alone. It's what they're actually doing before any legislation has passed. They're developing a shared taxonomy, a common vocabulary for what counts as a commodity, what counts as a security, and what lives in between. Without this shared vocabulary, even if legislation passes, these two agencies could interpret the same word differently and create new confusions in the future. They're building substituted compliance, meaning if a firm meets one agency's rules, the other agency agrees to treat that as sufficient. Right now, companies often have to register with both agencies separately, navigate two different sets of standards, and build two separate compliance processes. Substituted compliance collapses that into one front door. They're sharing market surveillance data in real time, so neither agency is making enforcement decisions in the dark. And they're drafting a formal memorandum of understanding, a document that is designed to outlast their own 10 years. They said that explicitly. They want this to survive the next administration. There was also one idea mentioned in this meeting that I want to spend just a moment on. Both chairs talked about the possibility of what they called a super app. And I think it's worth explaining what that actually means. Right now, if you want to trade stocks, you use a brokerage regulated by the SEC. If you want to trade commodity futures, you use a separate platform that is regulated by the CFTC. If a company wants to offer both, they need two separate registrations, two separate compliance teams, and they have to navigate two completely different regulatory relationships. A super app is what becomes possible when those walls come down. One account, one platform. Tokenized stocks, crypto commodities, derivatives, stablecoins, potentially all in the same place. The reason this hasn't existed isn't because of technicalities. It's because of regulation. And the two people with the authority to remove that barrier just stood in the same room and said they intend to do so. We keep hearing that America is behind when it comes to crypto regulation. Europe has MiCA. Hong Kong has its licensing regime. Dubai built an entirely new regulatory body from scratch. And for years, the story has been that American regulatory delay is pushing builders and capital offshore. But watching this meeting made me wonder something different. Because those other jurisdictions move fast, partly because they were starting from scratch. Singapore built its framework inside a system that manages a few $1 trillion in assets. Dubai built rules for a financial center that matters regionally. They could move quickly because the stakes of getting it wrong could be contained. America isn't retrofitting a regional financial center. It's retrofitting the system the entire world's financial infrastructure is priced against. Every derivative contract, every trade finance agreement, every sovereign debt instrument on Earth references benchmarks that flow through the SEC and the CFTC regulated markets. When those two agencies agree on shared vocabulary for digital assets, when they define how tokenized assets interface with existing market infrastructure, they're not just clarifying rules for crypto exchanges. They're potentially defining how those assets connect to the most trusted markets on Earth today. Singapore built a door. America is trying to connect the existing highway to it. This is slower. But what comes after or on the other side isn't comparable to what any other jurisdiction has built so far. It's a different order of magnitude, in my opinion. From the perspective of this channel in particular, this conversation lands in a very specific place. Because the language that was used in that meeting about infrastructure, settlement, clearing, how value moves across markets, is exactly how XRP has described its own purpose for years now. Not as speculation, but as rails, as a settlement layer, as financial infrastructure that could sit underneath the movement of value. What's interesting about this moment is that the regulators building the framework aren't describing a world where crypto is a separate alternative system. They're describing a world where digital assets become part of the existing plumbing. Tokenized collateral moving 24/7 across venues. AI systems monitoring risk in real time against tokenized assets. Capital markets coming on-chain. That's the world that they're preparing for. And in that world, rails matter. And I want to be very careful not to overpromise anything. The legislation is still uncertain. The stablecoin yield fight between banks and crypto platforms is unresolved. The politics around the SAVE Act are complicated. And what the regulators are building right now, without legislation behind it, is still only written in pencil. They said this for themselves. They want statute because they know that what they are building can be undone by the next administration without it. But what I keep coming back to is the direction of pressure. The president recently linked legislation with the SAVE Act, explicitly part of his own agenda. Institutions have capital waiting for regulatory clarity. It's sitting on the sidelines. The regulators are building infrastructure in anticipation of legislation passing in the future. Crypto firms have spent years preparing, and ordinary people are beginning to understand in plain language that their bank earns significantly more money, or their bank earns significantly more on their money than what it pays them. And that alternatives are forming in real time. When that last piece, public understanding, crosses a threshold or a tipping point, the political pressure stops coming only from the industry. It starts to come from voters. All of those levers are pointing in the same direction simultaneously. That doesn't guarantee anything to happen, but it's not nothing either. When I finished watching that meeting between the SEC and the CFTC, I noticed something that I absolutely did not expect. I felt calm, and that actually surprised me. Because if you look at all the headlines right now, calm is not exactly the word that most people would use. But I think I understand now what produced that feeling for me. It wasn't certainty. It was watching people who are responsible for what comes next actually preparing for it. Not speaking about digital assets as a possibility. Speaking about how markets might function as those assets become integrated into the financial system. Not possibility, but preparation. And preparation, especially at this level, suggests that someone is at least thinking seriously about what comes next. The legislation may be still uncertain. The politics may still be messy. But sometimes the most important signals in a transition aren't the arguments happening in public. They're the quieter moments when institutions begin preparing for a future the rest of the conversation hasn't fully caught up to yet. And that's what I think I was seeing in that room. If this kind of conversation is something you want more of, the infrastructure layer, not the price layer, then subscribe. If you want to go deeper on any of this, please join me for the next video, or even dig into the previous content that I've created. Or if you are looking for a way to support the work that I'm doing, there are links in the description below. Thank you for joining me for another episode as we dig into what I think is a transition in the way that money and information moves. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And this is James Harris, Layer 1. See you next time.